Lane every Sunday and pick up Bangladesh newspaper. Friday issue that used to come on Sunday, and read about politics and everything else, and go to cafes, different cafes, and talk politics. But really didn't understand, what was going on in Bangladesh. But we found the majority of our friends, and generally Bangladesh, they're very, very sort of patriotic. They love their country. They want to do something. They're really desperate about some of the things that we hear about. They want to change. So we used to talk politics, but never really understood issues or knew much about Bangladesh. So we decided, why don't we have monthly seminars? And end of Brick Lane, the other side in Shoreditch, is an organization called Weavers Youth Forum. They kindly allowed us to have their premises once a month, every Sunday. And so we used to have monthly seminars. We covered all sorts of topics. And the seminars also provided opportunity for people like us to actually take responsibility to research for a month and then come and make a presentation. It's a way of learning. So we got both experts plus us, who were interested in learning and testing the ideas. But then we got tired, and so we stopped. But we missed it. So we wanted to restart, and we kept on saying, let's restart, but it never happened. So last September we said, we're going to make it happen. So this is it. This is our first series, but this is also testing to see, meeting new people, what kind of interest and level of interaction. And so far we've been very encouraged. And based on feedback that we get from you, your interest, and in partnership with you, we want to organize other more interesting, better programs in the future. Another thing about Brick Lane Circle is that we don't believe in political correctness. Because we feel that political correctness actually stops you from learning. But it doesn't mean that in society when you live together you adopt right policies to deal with disadvantages, to deal with past injustices and so on. But when it comes to knowledge, you have to really let your mind go, this critical faculty to work through. So what we ask you tonight is that feel free not to ask anything, but try and use the logical process and evidence. That's it. I won't say anymore. Just one other thing. Economy is the backbone of all society, everything. If we don't have money, we can't pay our bills and we can't educate our children and so on. But living in this country, we also know that Bangladesh is a poor country compared to this country, and we know relatives and so on. And we want to contribute. Majority of people want to contribute, and they do contribute in different ways. But we all wish that our country could become very successful economically. But see here, most of us know very little how we can make it, what we can do, how we can make a positive contribution to our economy. And but I think if we get together, talk about it, understand more, learn more, then we can play a bigger role than now. And that's why Professor Mushtaq is here to talk to us about the drivers of economic change post-1980. He will have about 30 minutes presentation, and then we'll have up to 1 hour for discussion.
Okay. I don't know how much people in this room know about what's happening in Bangladesh and the Indian subcontinent. So it's very difficult for me because I normally lecture to students and I know exactly what they know, where they're coming from. It's a mixed crowd. Some of you might know some of the stuff, some of you might be lost. Please stop me, ask questions. It's not a formal lecture in that sense. Something very interesting is happening in the Indian subcontinent. And Bangladesh is not different from the rest of India. Bangladesh is slightly poorer than India, its growth rate is a little bit less than India. But in a sense, Bangladesh is not a unique country which is sitting nowhere in the middle of nowhere. It is very deeply connected with what's happening in the Indian subcontinent. And the interesting thing that is happening in the Indian subcontinent is from the 1980s, there has been an acceleration of growth. Growth has gone up in the Indian subcontinent, including Bangladesh, by around 2% a year. Now this is staggeringly important because for people who are not economists, 2% means nothing. But for an economist, 2% growth rate if you can sustain that over 30, 40 years, means a huge difference in living standards. Okay. So what has happened because at the same time we know that India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, all countries also suffer from huge problems of governance. Corruption is very high, the markets don't work, the economic system is very poorly organized, and yet growth has accelerated. So what I'm trying to talk about today is what's behind this, and there are some very interesting theoretical questions behind it, because a commonsensical answer that people will give you is what happened is that these countries liberalized. Okay? Now, one of the things I am going to argue is that this liberalization story doesn't really make much sense. And one way you can, it is true, but it's also false. It's a complex story. Okay? Now, why does liberalization not make sense as an explanation for this growth acceleration that happened in the 1980s? You have to go back a little bit. And this is where I'm going to show some slides and figures, but if you can't see it at the back, because the screen is actually smaller than I had thought, I'll explain what is going on. This first slide is a long-run history of per capita incomes. There's no way you can see it. I'm going to summarize it for you. This goes back to 1900, 1950, 1987, looking at what happened to per capita incomes in the Indian subcontinent. Now, what is interesting is, don't worry if you can't read it, okay? Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, between 1900 and 1950, per capita incomes actually went down. Okay, from 1900 to 1950, this is under British colonialism. Per capita incomes of these three countries went down at a time when the world per capita income was rapidly increasing. And the US and UK per capita incomes were rapidly increasing. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh became poorer. And they're very different from other countries in that sense. Now, what is interesting is that this period of impoverishment of India, Pakistan, at that time we were all India, in British India, the reason why we became, the context in which we became poor was one of complete free trade, which was a completely liberalized economy. There was completely free movement of capital, completely free movement of goods, there were no tariffs. So it's very interesting that in the period of the greatest free trade in the Indian subcontinent, we actually became poor. So the idea that free trade and liberalism is the explanation of our new success is problematic. Now, then what happens in some other figures quickly, because I will be putting some argument to these for most of my lecture. I just want to start with some figures. Then what happens in the 1950s is that in all the Indian subcontinental countries, growth goes up under very nationalistic interventionist policies. Okay, so you have a growth takeoff in the 50s, which then slows down in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Okay, so you have a growth takeoff after independence from Britain, and then from around 1968, 69, 70, 71, it goes down. In Bangladesh, it becomes negative, but Bangladesh is different because there was a independence and civil war and all kinds of other things going on in the early 70s. So that is an exceptional figure, minus 0.6%. But in all across the Indian subcontinent, growth goes down. Okay? And then again in the 1980s, growth goes up. So this is the big picture. We have to remember, how do you explain these? That all these countries go through the same trends. Right? Low growth during colonialism, growth take off in the 1950s, slow down in the 1960s, and then take off again in the 1980s. It's not just a Bangladesh phenomenon. This is the important thing. The same happens in manufacturing. We can skip this. Okay, this is the same story. Okay, you have an acceleration of growth in the 50s, deceleration in the late 60s, again acceleration in the 1980s. The same in agriculture. Okay, let's not get bogged down with the figures. The figures are here. If anyone wants to question, we can come back to the figures. And then finally, you have the really staggering takeoff of the 1980s, which is Bangladesh. 65 to 80, the growth rate was 2.4% GDP. GDP is the national income, okay, for those of you, gross domestic product. 2.4%, 1980 to 90 goes up by 2% to 4.3%, now is running at above 5%. This is a staggering increase in growth rates. India, same thing. Exactly the same time, 1980s, there is a 2% acceleration in growth rate. India this year is growing at close to 9%. Okay, so India has really taken off in a very... Same story in Pakistan. 1980s is a takeoff period in Pakistan. The same story also happens in China, but Chinese growth rates are significantly higher than the Indian subcontinent. There's a 4% increase in growth rates in the 1980s. But for the rest of the world as a whole, actually, growth is slowing down. Now this is very interesting because this acceleration of growth that happens in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh is not because the whole world is growing faster. Okay? The whole world actually slows down. If you look at the last growth, in the 1980s, the world growth rate goes down from 4.1% to 3.3%. So the world is slowing down, but South Asia takes off. Okay? So it's not just a question of everybody's growing, we are growing with them. Something peculiar is going on. Now what I want to say is that you have to look at South Asia together, because there are some very common things going on. And what are these common features of the Indian subcontinent? First is that we have very poor economic performance during colonial free trade. And colonial free trade is actually much more liberal than what we have today. You have full profit repatriation. A British company investing in Bengal or India or wherever, could make its profits and take it back completely. I mean, this is a dream of free market. Okay? You have stable property rights for British investors. There's no threat of nationalization, no threat of anything. The British rule India. You have no tariffs. The average tariff at that time is about 2%. Okay? So it's complete free trade, but no one invested in India. There's very little inward investment except in some tea gardens and some small-scale manufacturing like jute and cotton, but very trivial. Secondly, after independence, you have very nationalistic economic strategies in India. Nehru's planning. In Ayub, you have the forced industrialization in Pakistan. Nowadays, people are very critical of this planning, but actually, this planning regime, both in India and in Pakistan, and till 71, of course, we were part of Pakistan, achieved much higher growth rates than in the colonial period. Everyone forgets this. Actually, there was a huge acceleration of growth in the 1950s and 1960s with planned nationalistic economic strategies. The third thing is that in all these countries, growth slowed down in the late 60s for some mysterious reason. Early 70s was a disaster in all these countries. 1970s was a low growth period. There was growing political crisis in all South Asian countries in the 1970s. And then in the late 1970s, the planning systems break down. So all these countries have collapsing planning systems. The planning economic. I don't know how much you know of the history of these countries, but in the 60s and 70s, the economy was heavily regulated. To invest, to get credit, to import, to export, you needed permissions to do everything. Okay? So this was a kind of semi-planned type of economy, and this started collapsing and breaking down in the late 1970s. Very little formal liberalization happens, but tariff protection begins to be reduced in the early 1980s. Not much, a little bit. Subsidies for industry begin to disappear, because the early strategy was to subsidize industry for industrialization. The countries become basically bankrupt, they can't subsidize anything, so subsidies start disappearing. And now you have a new growth in the early 1980s driven by completely new sectors. These are not the sectors that were protected in the previous heavy industry, jute, cotton textiles. You have completely new sectors. In Bangladesh, you have garments and frozen foods and other, what in Bangladesh is called non-traditional sectors. In India, you have software and polished diamonds. Completely, I mean, this is not any, just random. In Pakistan, you have grey cotton cloth. So another mystery is why these strange new sectors emerge, which are driving very high rates of growth now. Within South Asia, India emerges as the strongest economy. Because the starting point is higher, its per capita income is higher, its level of industrialization is higher in the 1980s. So when it starts in this market-led industrialization, India does better than Pakistan and Bangladesh, and currently it attracts much higher foreign direct investment. FDI is foreign direct investment. So Bangladesh gets almost no foreign direct investment compared to India. The other thing common to all these countries is that they have some very common political trends. Again, people don't normally associate, what's common between these countries. Actually, there's a lot in common in the political story behind the economics. Economics and politics is very closely connected, of course. What are these things? First is that in the 1950s, you have very strong interventionist states, politically. And this is a product of the anti-colonial movement. Colonialism was identified with economic failure, with free markets. So when Pakistan and India got independence in 1947, the post-colonial regimes were very interventionist. They wanted to develop the economy from above. Okay, so they were control economies, interventionist economies. And this is based on a common political platform in both countries that we need to rapidly industrialize. Then in the mid-60s, you have something which is again common to all these countries. You have a growth of what political scientists call intermediate class politics. These are mass movements led by the petty bourgeois, the lower middle classes, who now, still today, drive politics in the Indian subcontinent. These are, in India, you have backward caste movements, different types of backward caste movements. In Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in the 60s, you have separatist federalist movements, again led by the lower middle classes. And the growth of these political movements of the lower middle classes, the Bengali nationalist movement is an example of this, is again common to all of India. You look at all across India, you find a lot of common features of these intermediate class movements beginning from the mid-1960s onwards. In all of these countries, this leads to a crisis of established politics in the early 1970s. In all of these countries, you have a turn to authoritarian populism. Authoritarian populism is apparently left-of-center parties using very hard measures to control the economy and the politics. In Bangladesh, you have Mujib. In Pakistan, you have Bhutto. In India, you have Indira Gandhi. There are very strong similarities between them. This is called populist authoritarianism. Populist in the sense they appeal to the masses, but authoritarian in the sense that they are very rigidly trying to control a increasingly fragmented polity. And in all three cases, this fails. Right? In all three, these three leaders are overthrown. In fact, all of them are killed. And in all three countries, you then have the final stage, which is a growing fragmentation of politics from the 1970s onwards. In India, you have weak coalition governments. In Bangladesh, you have this intense political contestation. We have been seeing an example of this in the last several months. And in Pakistan, you have weak governments which are so weak that you have military governments taking over. So there is a lot in common. In the politics, there is a lot in common in the economics. Now, how do we connect this into a story of the growth takeoff? And here is some suggestion that I am going to make, which is controversial because it goes against the straightforward liberalization story. And I need to go into a bit of economic theory here, which might bore you completely, but it's very important to understand, and I hope you will try to follow it a little bit and ask questions and so on if you don't follow. I want to challenge the standard story that what happened in the 1980s was liberalization. Liberalization is not a satisfactory explanation because actually in the 1980s there was very little reform. In India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, there was actually very little reform. The reform started in the 1990s, but growth took off in 1980. So growth took off before the reform started. Now, the details of this I can go into, but this is actually now well recognized by most economists. And it's true for all three countries. But the most important problem for the liberalization story is the problem that I mentioned earlier, that under British rule, there was no growth at all, when you have much more and deeper liberalization. Was there an increase in investment? There was some increase in investment in the 1980s, but it was actually not very much. If you look at these figures, India, Pakistan and Bangladesh still invest as a share of GDP much less than China. In India and Bangladesh, it's about 20% of GDP is invested, compared to 30% in China. Pakistan is a bit lower because of some special problems Pakistan is having right now with conflict and war on its borders. So Pakistan is a slightly, but India and Bangladesh are quite comparable actually. And their investment share is much lower than China. In the 1980s, there was an increase in investment share, but it is not significant. In an economic sense, this is not significant to explain the sustained growth spurt that we have in the last 20 years. Nor can you explain it in terms of governance and infrastructure. There's no evidence that infrastructure improved in these countries. In fact, infrastructure is weak and is probably just as weak today as it was 20 years ago. It remains notoriously bad. Roads, railways, ports, extremely weak in the Indian subcontinent, not just in Bangladesh. Moreover, economists have actually studied whether there's any correlation between growth in India and those parts of India which spend more on infrastructure or education. And the answer is there is little correlation. The parts of India which spend more on infrastructure and more on education don't grow faster. Okay? So growth is not in any simple sense correlated with education or infrastructure. These are important, but certainly doesn't explain what happened. And governance, which means rule of law, corruption, all of those, democracy, remains poor in the Indian subcontinent. And there is no evidence that this improved before the 1980s. So unless there was an improvement in governance in 1970s, how do you explain the growth takeoff in terms of governance? You cannot. In fact, there is a lot of evidence that governance is getting worse, certainly in Bangladesh and many parts of India. Political violence, political corruption increasing. And this is not just happening in badly performing areas like eastern Uttar Pradesh or Bihar, but also in areas of India, subcontinent, which with growth acceleration. Look at Gujarat, look at Bangladesh. Governance is extremely poor, but you have relatively high rates of growth. So there's no simple correlation that, if you have good governance, you will have better growth. So let's go back to some basic economic theory. What drives growth in a more or less market economy where you have to produce, export in global markets? There are two ways you can succeed. Okay? I'm simplifying as much as I can. There are two ways you can succeed. One is you use your existing competitiveness. Existing competitiveness is what are things you can immediately make for a profit. You make those things and you sell them. The other is you develop competitiveness in areas where you are not competitive now, but you will be competitive in the future. Okay? Now, developing competitiveness is a much more difficult task because it means that for some time you will be making losses. You are going to make things which you are not making money right now, but which have potential high profit and high value added in the future. Whereas if you make things which you are good at making right now, you are going to make money immediately. It might not be much money, but you will make some money, but you will make it right now. Now obviously, not obviously, let's continue. If you want to start growing using existing competitiveness, that is, produce things which you already could potentially make, then all you need is money. Right? So all you need is access to capital markets. You need a good banking system. You need good contracts. So you need a good minimal governance system. If you have a minimal governance and if you have access to credit, you can grow rapidly or as rapidly as possible using your existing competitiveness. So that is a much simpler strategy. All you need is money. And money, you can borrow, banks will lend and so on. But if you try to do the second, you have a much more fundamental requirement, which is that somebody has to subsidize you while you are achieving competitiveness, and that somebody who is subsidizing you has to have the power to compel you to raise your productivity, because otherwise you will waste the money. There's no point giving someone money to raise their productivity because they can just eat it and not raise their productivity. So if you are subsidizing for productivity growth, you must have a strong state, which can withdraw the subsidy if you are not performing and give it to somebody else. So if you have a state which can give a subsidy to raise productivity, but also to withdraw the subsidy when you are not performing, then you can develop new competitiveness or in areas where you don't have competitiveness yet. Now this is really the fundamental issue. There's a huge debate within economics, and the position I take is that countries which are trying to grow rapidly from a poor base need to develop competitiveness in areas where they don't have competitiveness. And that requires institutions and governance capacities which are very difficult to achieve. Now, why is it important for countries to try and do the second? Here it gets a little bit more complicated. The problem is that the kinds of things that poor countries are already good at doing, sectors where you already have competitiveness, are very few in number. There are very few things that a developing country can immediately make today profitably, even though their wages might be 1/20th the wages of the United States. There are very few things Bangladesh can export to the United States, even though its wages are 1/20th US wages. And this is a very interesting question. Why? Why is a poor country unable to export competitively to countries where wages are 20, 30 times higher? And the answer is actually staggeringly simple, which is that their productivity is even lower. Productivity is how much each worker produces. Okay, so your wages might be 1/20th, but if your productivity is 1/30th, you're not going to be profitably be able to export anything. Now here is the real question: is why is that the case? Low-wage economies often have higher unit costs of production than high-wage economies. This is the paradox and the challenge of development. We are a poor-wage, low-wage country. We paradoxically find we have a higher unit cost of producing cars, or whatever it is, than the US or Japan. Even if you take the same machine, right? You take the Japanese factory, you dismantle it, you bring it to India, you find that the cost of production in India is higher than in Japan, with the same machine. This is really, staggering, a staggering problem. And these are some figures, I'm not just making it up. If you look at cotton spinning, very simple thing, cotton spinning, right? Using identical machinery, that is, using the same machines. In the United States, in 1978, productivity per hour, per worker hour, was 7.4 times higher than India. It's not that Indian machines are not good. You take the same machine from the US to India, the US worker is making 7.4 times more. There's 740% more per hour than an Indian worker. And this is staggering. This is mind-blowing. Right? In 1990, Indian textile productivity was 25%, 1/4 of US productivity in 1959. So what the US was doing in 1959, in 1990, Indian productivity is 1/4. Staggering figures. I don't know if you, when I saw these figures first, I was staggered. And this is not making rockets or motor cars, this is textile. This is Why is productivity so low? Why is productivity using the same machines, identical machines? Most people would immediately say education. Our workers are not educated. Actually, this doesn't make sense. Productivity does not correlate with differences in education. And it's a very simple story, right? I'm in the business of education. I value education a lot, and I think education is very important. But if you put me into a car factory, my productivity will be extremely low. Most people here are very educated. If you go into a textile factory, your productivity will be extremely low. There is no correlation between your educational qualifications and productivity, because productivity is not something you can learn in a school. Nor is productivity explained by differences in good governance. That is, if you have property rights stability and democracy, your productivity will be high. Because we have seen that some of the high growth in India is happening in parts of India which are not very stable. So, what is this connected to? Again, there is a lot of controversy in economics. I'm giving you the explanations that I think work, without going through all the possible different explanations. The explanation that I think works is that it is very difficult to organize the labor process. And it takes time to learn how to do that. And that time to learn is something that you have to spend in the factory. It is what economists call learning by doing. You learn by actually doing this thing again and again and again under a lot of pressure from above, that unless you learn rapidly, you will lose your job or you will lose your livelihood or your factory will close down. The compulsion is not enough. You have to have the pressure that unless you learn, you will lose your job, but you must also have the opportunity, which is that you must be actually working in the factory, learning how to do these things. And it's this combination of learning with compulsion that raises productivity. It's not something you can learn in a school. You cannot set up some classes for it. It has to be done in the factory. And this is what economists call tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is knowledge that you cannot learn in a book. It's knowledge that you learn by doing. It's experience knowledge. Okay? And tacit knowledge is really the big constraint, because the developing country does not have a long industrial history. We don't have a pool of workers whose history has been in different kinds of factories, who therefore know how a production line works, who you can take into another factory, and they have a lot of tacit knowledge about how to organize production. In a developing country, this pool of workers, middle management, supervisors, factory managers, completely missing. Okay? So you might take the machine, but you have no one who knows how the hell to operate it. And you cannot learn this. Labor discipline, again, something very difficult to learn, to achieve, and to organize. Efficient routines, how to organize the workplace, the production process, is very difficult to achieve. What all of these processes have in common is that they take time. They take time, and they take actually operating within the factory environment with a lot of pressure on you to learn. This is why the free market by itself does not mean you will succeed. If you don't have an environment where new people who don't have this knowledge can be trained and technology can be upgraded, you might actually have falling behind, not convergence. I mean, these are all technical terms. Convergence means free market economic theory says that if you have a free market, countries will converge. That is, their per capita incomes will become closer and closer together. Okay? Because capital will go from rich countries to poor countries. There will be more investment in poor countries because wages are low, so they will catch up. This doesn't have to happen if the productivity in the poor country is so low that capital doesn't go there. Then you will not have convergence, you will have divergence, because in fact whatever capital there is in poor countries will go to the rich countries, because you can make more money in the rich country, paradoxically. And this is exactly what happens. There's a lot of capital flight from poor countries because rich people in poor countries take their money out and invest in rich countries and make money. And this is really, the free market can actually result in divergence, not convergence. This is something which is very difficult to explain if you have a very liberal economics, but it's very easy to explain if you have this kind of approach. Secondly, the gap in productivity is likely to be bigger in more sophisticated technologies. So when you take something like garments production is very simple technology. So the difference in productivity between a garments factory in London and a garments factory in Bangladesh, there is a difference in productivity, but it's not very much. Whereas the wage differential is very big and wipes out the productivity differential. So a garments factory is profitable in Bangladesh, okay? Because it's very simple technology. If we take a very sophisticated technology, like how to make an aircraft wing, here the productivity gap is huge and the wage differential doesn't wipe it out. You might have workers at 1/20th or 1/30th the wage. It's still profitable to make it in the US. So, therefore, poor countries get trapped into making low technology products. And once you get trapped into making low technology products, you have a very serious problem that low technology products also have low productivity growth. So there is no productivity growth in garments. There is no productivity growth in diamond polishing. So once you get trapped into making these things, you are not getting richer and richer, you are stuck where you are. Whereas the high productivity stuff has technical progress, and the technical progress is what gives you productivity growth year after year after year, which is why it's very important to latch into the high technology areas, like how to make aircraft wings, or how to make sophisticated rubber, or how to make very sophisticated steel. Because these are the areas in which you have productivity growth, because the technology is upgrading. And therefore, if you are producing these things, year after year after year, you will have wage growth and productivity. And this is a very important problem in Bangladesh. We have a lot of garments manufacturing, but people who work in garments manufacturing are not enjoying any wage growth. How can you enjoy wage growth if the production process has not got any productivity growth? To pay the higher wages, you must have productivity growth. So you have enormous now growing political tensions in Bangladesh with garments workers demanding higher wages, and manufacturers saying we can't pay these wages. And both sides are right. Why should workers keep working year after year after year for the same wages? And how can employers pay them higher wages if there is no productivity growth? The answer is, we can't be stuck in garments producing. You have to move out into higher productivity, higher growth areas where workers can get higher wages year after year after year. And this is really the problem. So what happens is that markets by themselves are very bad in organizing this second type of catching up, which is catching up by developing competitiveness in areas where you don't have it now, but you will have it in the future. In theory, this could be done by the market. It could be done by entrepreneurs and venture capitalists going and investing in developing countries to raise their productivity in the future, but this doesn't happen. So, and there are good reasons why it doesn't happen, which is technical, which if you're interested, we can discuss it later. The stress on governance reforms and property rights reforms in developing countries, which some of you may have heard about, there is a lot of literature on good governance in developing countries, is really about market-driven growth using existing competitiveness. As I said, if you are simply relying on existing competitiveness, all you need is good governance and credit. Much of the reforms that we are talking about today in Bangladesh or India or Pakistan is not about how to catch up developing new competitiveness. So, let's get back to the story that I was trying to explain. What happened in India after independence? What you had was a recognition by Indian and Pakistani states that free markets didn't work, and you had a period of industrial policy. Okay? And this industrial policy took different forms in India and Pakistan, but it was really about creating competitiveness in areas where the country did not already have competitiveness. Okay? So a lot of subsidies were given to new sectors, iron, steel, cement, shipbuilding, whatever it was, and it differed in Pakistan and India. And these subsidies allowed these countries to start making things which they never made before. Okay? This is why you have this huge burst of growth in the 1950s and 1960s. So growth took off in the 1950s and 1960s. But it didn't sustain itself. Why did it not sustain itself? My answer is very simple. It didn't sustain itself because India and Pakistan did not have the governance capacities to discipline the subsidy recipients. They could not discipline them. People got subsidies, but the state was not strong enough to take the subsidy away when performance was poor. This was a critical failure, and this is why the Indian and Pakistani and now Bangladeshi states are different from the Korean, Chinese or Taiwanese state, is because in the East Asian states, when you get a subsidy to learn, to develop competitiveness, you know that you have to perform. If you don't perform, the state will take the subsidy away after some time. And they have the political capacity to do this. That is what forces industry to raise its productivity, because they know the state will take the subsidy away if you don't perform. Whereas in India or Pakistan or Bangladesh, the state lacks the capacity to withdraw the subsidy. So you get the subsidy, you start producing, but then you have no productivity growth because everyone relaxes, because they know the state can never take the subsidy away. And so you have this story of infant industries that never grow up. And the result of this is that the industrial lending banks in Bangladesh went bankrupt, the industrial lending banks in Pakistan went bankrupt, and in India, where the subsidies happen through the budget, the fiscal deficit shot up through the air, and by the late 1970s had to be abandoned. So in all three countries, the subsidy program went wrong. The state could not control the withdrawal of subsidies from non-performers. So this is basically my story. Okay, I mean, the colonial experience led to the free market strategy being abandoned. There was a period of high growth through subsidization of new sectors and new industries, but there was no disciplining. There was no disciplining of subsidy recipients, and so by the late 1960s, the whole process ground to a halt. In all three countries, the same thing happens, because it takes about 15-20 years for the strategy to fail. Initially, when you give the subsidies, you have high growth, new firms are being set up, but there is no productivity growth. Now what happens in the 80s? In the 1980s, you have a very fortunate combination of things which are happening, again, throughout the Indian subcontinent. The subsidy program, the catching up strategy failed, but they created some minimal entrepreneurial capacities. They created some wealthy people with enough money and enough skills to start thinking of operating in global markets. And they built up some technical capacities, even though the main programs had failed. And the way in which the political system had fragmented meant that individual capitalists could always find political friends who would be able to protect their assets for them for a price. This is a much more complicated story, and I'm not going to go into it right now. Okay? So, but the main thing that is relevant for us now, because I want to leave some time for discussion, is that the 1980s takeoff would not have happened without the preceding 20 years of subsidization strategy, which created the minimal technical capacities and competences for this takeoff to happen. Now, the minimal floor that was created is very different in different countries. In Bangladesh, we are at a much lower technical level. We are at the level of garments production, shrimp packaging, very simple technologies. In India, where there was a much bigger investment in high technology during the subsidization phase under Nehru, where India developed heavy industry and heavy machine tools and a lot of very skilled human capital, they have produced the human capital to go into software and offshore businesses and so on. And in Pakistan, where there was a lot of investment in textile industries, they created the capacity for grey cloth production and cheap cotton textiles. So the technologies are different, but the previous phase of 20 years of heavy subsidization provided the base for the takeoff. And this is very important, because without this, liberalization would not have worked. Liberalization, or the collapse of the planning system, allowed these capacities that had been built up for 20 years with subsidization to find new opportunities in global markets, and they started exporting whatever they were already good at producing, which is basically low technology products, okay, where there was no further learning required because they already had developed the minimum competence. Now this has some very important implications. How do we achieve new competences in the future? This is a real puzzle. Not puzzle, challenge. Okay? We have come to some kind of threshold with a planning mechanism. The planning mechanism collapses. People who have already developed some competence have now taken off in these areas. What's next? What are the new competences that we will develop, and how will we develop them? This analysis has some implications. It means that we can explain why growth in India, and by India I mean Indian subcontinent, has not spread to everybody. Most people in India and Bangladesh and Pakistan still are desperately poor. The people who are benefiting are people who already have high competence. High competence means that they have something they can sell in the global market. It might not mean that they're all rocket scientists. But the people who have the minimum capacity to have competitiveness in global markets are a very small fraction of the whole population. Even a garments worker in Bangladesh is very privileged. For this reason, within India, you have growing regional disparities. Some parts of India are taking off very rapidly. Gujarat, Maharashtra, some parts of India are worse than Bangladesh. Eastern Uttar Pradesh and Bihar are poorer than Bangladesh. And within Bangladesh, you have growing regional disparities. The political situation all across India is very precarious, is very fractionalized, huge amount of contestation, and this also means that the type of stability you require for growth is very precarious. And we have seen this in Bangladesh in recent months. But the most important implication is the last one. Now that all these countries have abandoned the catching up through developing new competence strategies, mainly because they could not police the strategies in the past, they could not impose discipline, means that the only technical progress that is now happening in the Indian subcontinent is from those entrepreneurs who are already very sophisticated and can themselves bring in the foreign technology profitably, or by foreign direct investors, which, as I said, in Bangladesh is almost negligible. Okay? But in India is happening to some extent. Now, this is a very weak basis for sustained growth. And paradoxically, although growth is very high, the underlying problem is that this growth is now driven by sectors which already have competitiveness, which means a very small number of sectors, which means basically low technology sectors. And the long-term prospects, therefore, are not that good. And this is something which most people don't realize. When they look at India or Bangladesh, they see that 1980s, 1990s, much better than 1960s, so things must be a lot better. Yes, it's a lot better, but it's very vulnerable. It's very vulnerable because we have no strategy of keeping up with the progress of technical upgrading. So, this is the last slide. How to reform? The challenges are several. One is how to reform our politics. And to reform our politics is not about good governance and getting rid of corruption and these very, very ambitious targets which are completely impossible in the real context of Indian subcontinent. Okay? If you set yourself these ambitious targets, you will get nowhere. But what we can hope for is some form of mass party politics which will give us enough stability for growth to continue. And in some cases, we don't even have that. Okay? So instead of setting ourselves targets which are extremely ambitious, get rid of corruption, have completely accountable democracy, this is what you will hear in Bangladesh or India. These targets are actually not very useful because we are long distance away from having those kinds of societies. And the examples which are more realistic is to look at mass parties in places like China or Vietnam, or even regional parties in some parts of India, like Congress in Maharashtra or CPM in West Bengal, which have mass parties that can combine enough redistribution for keeping political stability with enough social discipline for growth. And that only mass political parties can do. Individual-based politics, which is the kind of politics we have in Bangladesh today, where some leader has some personal followers and they try to keep power, this is extremely destabilizing and doesn't work. So one challenge is how to construct reasonably democratic mass parties which can maintain enough political stability even in the presence of some moderate amounts of corruption and bad governance and so on. This will not go away in the near future. The second challenge is how to influence governments and international agencies to develop the governance capacities for targeted industrial policy interventions. In other words, we need to be able to develop new competences. We need, particularly in Bangladesh, because we are much lower down than India in terms of our technical level. In Bangladesh, we need to develop some targeted strategies for developing new technical capacity, not in very sophisticated technology, but in moderate technology. How to have backward linkages from the garment sector back into making zippers, or how to make backward linkage from garment sector into making buttons. Now, when you go from stitching to making buttons or zippers, this is a huge investment jump because the technology for making a button, or for making a dye, or for making fabrics is much more expensive, much more sophisticated, and requires much more learning and competence, but we have no strategies of how to get there. and so it's not happening. So parallel to the political strategy, which we have to have some realistic economic strategy of technology upgrading, which means inevitably some forms of hidden subsidies so that learning can happen. Hidden subsidies, because nowadays you cannot give explicit subsidies because of WTO and other international constraints. So you can't give cash to a firm, but you can have many forms of hidden subsidies, like, for example, prioritizing infrastructure to certain areas, or giving tax breaks to certain types of firms, or giving having industrial training schemes which allow people to train their workers within the firm. There are many ways you can give a subsidy which is clever, which will not fall foul of the WTO, provided your national bureaucrats and your national politicians understand what to do and can bargain and negotiate in the WTO. And currently Bangladesh doesn't have that skill. Okay, so you need a sophisticated bureaucracy, a sophisticated political leadership, sophisticated enough to understand that technology upgrading has to be achieved. And we learn from the countries which are successful at it, like China or Thailand or Malaysia, and see why we can't do that in Bangladesh. So, to finish, we have this growth spurt. This growth spurt is based on a failed policy of catching up in the past. Nevertheless, even the failed policy of the 50s and 60s was better than the free trade before. We now have a market-driven growth strategy across the Indian subcontinent, which is using existing competence, and what we don't have is how to develop new competence. That is a challenge. So I've tried to give you a very quick overview of where we are, how we got here. I'm sure some of you found this a bit heavy, but others I think know a lot about Bangladesh and might find this very obvious. So I've tried to hit at the middle level, and maybe we can have a discussion now.
Thank you very much. Okay. We will go straight to you can ask questions, make comments, criticize the speaker's explanations, whatever. I think we got Mushtaq at the back.
I feel very bad for not taking the privilege of asking the question, because unfortunately I missed most of the presentation. But nevertheless, I feel I should ask that question. Do you think reducing reducing corruption is more as a byproduct of economic development, or as an input into development processes?
So question is
yes,
okay. I actually have a very long answer to that, which I don't want to give. But I don't want to take up too much time because I've spent many, many years researching corruption and rent seeking and so on. The answer is long because there isn't one type of corruption. When you say corruption, there are many different varieties of things which we call corruption. And so corruption is a very complex phenomenon. Some types of corruption are actually what prevents the disciplining that I was talking about earlier from happening, which you missed. And so a government which has to have the capacity to upgrade its technology must be able to contain some types of corruption. There are other types of corruption which are structural to a poor country and which it is very difficult to get rid of until you have much higher levels of development. And these types of corruption you can't get rid of in the short run. And if you try to do that, you're wasting your time. And it doesn't mean this is okay, acceptable, good, or fine. It basically means that you have to be clever about what kind of corruption you want to target, because if you target everything, you will be wasting your time, you will achieve nothing. Okay? So, a lot of the problem with our anti-corruption strategy and the strategy which is pushed on us by the donors and the World Bank and so on, is that they don't make any discrimination between different types of corruption. Let me give you one example of a type of corruption which you cannot fight. Okay? If you look at this country, how is political stability maintained? Okay? Political stability is maintained in this country through a political process. That political process taxes, on average, 40% of GDP. I mean, think of 40% of the GDP of this country is taxed. People say the United States is a free market country. Do you know what percentage of the US GDP is taxed? It's 35%. Not much different. France and other European countries tax 50% of the GDP. So, an advanced capitalist country taxes between 35 to 50% of its GDP. Most of this is redistributed. Okay? It basically goes from my pocket to other people's pockets in straight transfers or in public services or in different kinds of mechanisms, and this redistribution is what keeps political stability, so that people are not fighting on the streets most of the time. Most of the time, they're having debates about how to get a share of this budget. So people go to parliament and have a debate about how to spend the budget because there's a big budget. Almost half of the GDP is up for redistribution. Now, if you take a developing country, what is the share of GDP that is taxed? You are lucky if you can tax 15%. Very lucky. And because most of the economy is non-formal. It's peasant agriculture, it's street hoppers. How do you tax these people? So if you can tax 15% of it, you're very lucky. And your GDP is tiny. $500 per capita. This is your average GDP. And you tax 15% of that, means there is virtually nothing in your budget. So after you have paid your civil servant salaries, most developing countries are running a budget deficit. So what are you going to redistribute? And this explains why actually in developing countries most people don't go to parliament. This is why the Awami League, when it was in opposition, spent not one day it went to parliament last year. Why? Because there's nothing to discuss in parliament. By the time you come to parliament, the money has been spent. Right? The donors have, even the money that goes to the budget through sectoral spending policies is spent before the money hits the ground. So there is nothing to discuss in parliament. So how is political stability kept in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh? What is the process? Why are people not shooting themselves in large numbers on the street? Is because of political corruption. Because the way in which political stability is achieved is through a lot of off-budget transfers where political leaders raise money outside the budget to give to powerful people who they bring into their party, who if they didn't would otherwise have blown the country up. So the political party in Bangladesh or India or Pakistan consists of thugs. They consist of people who can organize a lot of force and opposition and agitation, and they are bought off through off-budget transfers. So if you look at how the Congress party operates in India or the BNP operates in Bangladesh or the Muslim League in Pakistan, it's the same. The party is a collection of powerful organizers who keep the peace, okay, and who are paid off through off-budget transfers. So when Rajiv Gandhi gets involved in the Bofors scandal, it's not because Rajiv Gandhi needs the money, personally, but Rajiv Gandhi's party needs the money. Because if the party doesn't have the money, this party will not survive. Somebody else will come and throw the Congress out and they will be in power. Now this is structural. Till you can get a GDP which can be taxed to the tune of 30 to 40% and you can maintain your political stability through fiscal transfers which are transparent and you can debate in parliament, you are not going to make a huge dent on political corruption. However horrible it is, I am not supporting it. Okay? I don't support what is happening in Bangladesh or India or Pakistan. But I'm saying this is structural. Structural means this is not up to one individual with goodwill, like Professor Yunus or whoever, who can win an election and solve the problem. If Professor Yunus wins, he will have the same problem. Okay? And a very good example of this is Indonesia. Think of the overthrow of Mr. Suharto by the democratic movement in Indonesia. Suharto was an incredibly corrupt person. I don't know how to switch it off. But the people who threw him out thought that corruption is a matter of personal integrity and personal choice. To some extent it is, but not entirely. So when Suharto was thrown out, he was succeeded by a very pious and honest man called Abdul Rahman Wahid. I don't know if you know this history, okay? In 6 months, Abdul Rahman Wahid was accused of corruption. And he was, although not himself. He was a very religious and pious man, and I believe that he had no intention of being corrupt, but his party was corrupt. And there is no way you can keep a political process in places like Indonesia or Bangladesh going unless you can provide resources to your powerful party people, and these resources are not going to come from the budget. So, you have to make a distinction between which types of corruption you need to target right now as an input into development, and which types of corruption are an output of development. That is, once you get development, you will then be able to reduce this corruption. And I take a position, all corruption is bad. But if you try to fight all of it now, the only thing you will achieve now is being defeated. Because you will not get anywhere. And you will not achieve anything. And we have Marcos in the Philippines, we have Suharto in Indonesia, we have Ershad in Bangladesh. Ershad in Bangladesh is now being chased by all the political parties. We have Congress in India. Every, third world corruption, anti-corruption drive has failed. And I think that the reason it has failed is not because there weren't good people there who didn't have good intentions. It has failed because they don't understand there are some structural problems. I've just mentioned one. There are some other structural problems. This is why we could have a whole discussion on corruption another day.
Okay, you first, then she's first. Okay.
Talking about the structural corruption, I was just wondering, recently this present government is taking up all these buildings of these corrupted coalitions. From my point of view, it's just it's being destructive and taking up these infrastructures are going to hurt. I mean, there's already inputs and investment has been made. Now, taking them down, you're de-investing yourself. But I had a discussion with a couple of people from Bangladesh, and they actually support that they should actually take down this building, because when this government will really get out of the office and new political party will come in, all these political leaders will go back and actually take control of these buildings or these big markets that they actually had, and this caretaker government took off from them. So I'm just curious to know, what do you actually think, what is this caretaker government is doing right now is a corruption drive for the country? Is that is the kind of a right way to do, or they could have actually done